Exactly 20 years ago, Dawn and I were pregnant for the first time. And yes, I realize it was more her than me. Yet I was at fault, so I was the one in for it. And being 8 months pregnant and watching the Twin Towers fall, watching planes crash into the Pentagon in Pennsylvania, and watch our world just stop. Planes were grounded, plans were scrapped. Everything came to a screeching halt. And it was kind of like, the world was just bumped, kind of tipped on its axis a bit, and we just didn't know what to expect. And when you're pregnant during that time, it's kind of unsettling at another level, where you're wondering, should we be bringing a baby into this world in this surreal moment? Within weeks, the United States invaded Afghanistan in what has been the longest war in history. And I know you're probably like me. We've watched in horror over these weeks the difficult events, the difficult images and stories about people at the Kabul airport trying to leave. What was their home country? A place where they want to stay and remain, and yet it's so unstable. They need to leave. They're willing to lift babies over the wall. And you can understand what grandparents and parents of all distances from those kids would feel and wonder. We've felt the ripples even in the last few weeks of Haiti, a country that is the poorest country in the world that just continues to suffer one hardship after another, from the assassination of their president and now dealing with deaths in the thousands through this earthquake. And if you're from California, or if you've got family in California, you can't help but watch the fire burning there, the Dixie Fire, among others. That's the largest fire in California history, and yet not feel something deep within you of unsettledness. But those are just what we could open up our phones or watch the news and read about. What about here locally, where we have to see what's been happening to police officers trying to defend us, trying to catch the bad guys, and now are in critical care? Or when people just time and time again think, well, we've got a disagreement, then we need a gun. And even on the Friday the 13th shooting at Washington, where two 14-year-olds, one a bully, another wanting to stand up to a bully, not wanting to fight, and yet ends up dying and losing his life on the playground. You hear all this, and it's a wash of things, right? That doesn't even mention what's going on in our own mental health, in our own families, with our marriages, with our children, the things that we face day in and day out. We long for a healing word, frankly. We long for a way out, some kind of relief that's beyond a substance, beyond the different ways that we've tried before, but a healing word from God. Well, I can tell you, at First Christian, we are a people who first follow Jesus. That's what we're all about. With all the clatter that's going on, our path is set for us. And it's one where we are lining up behind Jesus. And we're spending our life in the presence of Jesus, trying to learn what that's like, to be with Him wherever we go. And that means that as we try to figure out what's next in our lives, we try to do the things that Jesus did. We try to duplicate His life, His way of being in this world. Which means bubbling up from our hearts are the words that He said, the things that He expressed, the teachings that He articulated, the wisdom that He infused into this world. And it does mean at times that we have to go into uncomfortable places that maybe we don't feel prepared to go, actions that we're not quite ready to take, but yet we're following behind Jesus. In fact, just to know about this group of people that makes their mission following Jesus, if you're new to us, if you're hearing me online and this is your first experience with First, I want you to know that for the last 5 weeks, the people of this church have been praying for their neighbors, secretly, quietly. All the leaders of our groups, the members of those groups, leaders of our church, they've been praying for their neighbors by name. So if you're hearing my voice for the first time, you need to know that you've been prayed for. that we care about our neighbors and that you're welcome here. You're welcome to wrestle with life in the way that we wrestle with life, to wrestle with some of the same things, and to do it imperfectly as we attempt to follow Jesus, making that our daily decision, our step into the future. Last week we began a new teaching that is to help us on this path. Trust is greater than or equal to our fear. Because we've been looking at these fears and wondering what to do with them. And last week we realized that as believers who follow Jesus, we have a different set of fear. We're not concerned with the same kinds of fears, even though they impact us. Our fear is the fear of God, not terror. In fact, a better way to say fear would be trust, which is why this is greater than or equal to. Trust greater than equal to fear. We have chosen that as our fear, that as our trust. And that brings us to our story. A story of a group of people in great strife, in great turmoil. And I want to read it to you. It's an old story. And if you'd like to, join with me in standing as I read not all of Exodus chapter 2. I'm going to pick up with the last verse of chapter 1 and read about 15 verses. Exodus 1:22. Then Pharaoh commanded all of his people, "Every boy that's born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile River, and every girl you shall let live." Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a child. And when she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him for 3 months. When she could hide him for no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him, plastered it with bitumen and pitch, and then she put it and the child in among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. And while her attendants walked beside the river, she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child, and he was crying. She took pity on him. This must be one of the Hebrew children, she said. Then his sister stepped forward and said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "And I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter. She took him as her son, and she named him Moses, because, she said, "I drew him out of the water." One day, after Moses had grown up, he went out to his people, and he saw their forced labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsfolk. And he looked this way, and he looked that way. And when he saw that no one was around, he killed the Egyptian and he hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, he saw 2 Hebrews fighting, and he said to the one who was in the wrong, Why do you strike your fellow Hebrew?" He answered, "Who made you a ruler over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid, and he thought, "Surely this thing is known." When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh. He settled in the land of Midian, and he sat down by a well. The word of the Lord. You can be seated. Now, this is a story of fear, of turmoil, of a group of people that don't have a home, the Hebrews, who are certainly outside of that home and in a foreign country of Egypt. But they had come to that land in kind of a worker status. They'd been able to partner with Pharaoh, see release from a famine and had kind of a special status. But this Pharaoh changed that status. Changed it from a worker status to a slave status. Have you had this happen before? Some of us have immigrated to this country. You know what it's like to have to find your way to work in a place that's not your home. Well, and then to have that status changed is difficult. Well, it gets even worse because their burdens are increased, their suffering is increased. Maybe some of you have had that happen to you before, where your boss changes your job description entirely. And now you kind of feel like maybe they're trying to push you out by changing this job description and making it not like what it was when you came. And this leader, this Pharaoh, starts off making a secret of his desire to wipe out the Hebrew people. Let's do it secretly. Let's kill these babies and make it an accident. But the secret plan to eliminate the Hebrews doesn't work out. That doesn't stop a leader. He goes public. Let's execute all of them. Let's throw all of the babies into the Nile. A massacre of babies is what he calls for. And this is difficult because now it's intentional. Now, I know how we are. People are going to complain about a mask mandate, right? We're going to complain about getting a vaccine. Is there any comparison to the execution of a population of people, a holocaust of people? It's hard to make that comparison. And yet here, a young couple says, I think it's time to have a baby. It seems like this is the wrong time to have a baby with an execution order quite like this. And yet, maybe it's comparable to what it's like as moms and dads have had to think about these things that I've talked about, of what it's like to raise a child all across the world in the midst of a pandemic or in the midst of a world crisis. It's difficult for this even priestly couple. Well, the woman, her belly is something of an execution chamber if it's found out, and she hides the pregnancy. I don't know how you do that. Maybe the robes help somehow, but she hides the pregnancy. And then she gives birth. I don't know how she hides that. Does she say, well, he ended up in the Nile or he died? For 3 months, she hides the baby secretly until she could do it no longer. And we could connect with this. We know what this is like with mothers trying to save their children. We've seen it on our screens. We've heard the stories of what it's like to lift a baby over the wall, right? That's all she's trying to do. And now, she provides a basket for the baby to put it out on the water. That doesn't seem like a better option. It seems like a difficult option. And yet, look at the bravery of this story of a sister, an older sister who follows the basket. A sister that might have been 6, might have been 12, we don't know. But she follows it, and as it would happen, the basket shows up where the Pharaoh's daughter is bathing. And the daughter takes the baby and has pity upon the baby. And at that moment, didn't say she's going to do anything, but at that moment, Miriam comes through the reeds and says, would you like me to go get a handmaid to nurse the child from the Hebrew women? And Pharaoh's daughter, knowing the decree, says yes. Here, even Pharaoh's daughter is one that's a lot like God, going down to the water where his people are and drawing them out. And that's the name she chooses to give Moses, one who is drawn out. Well, this story gets very personal because now we have names of people that are affected. And Moses is one who, well, he's grown up with his mom, paid to be his mom, but yet he's grown separate from his Hebrew people. He's had all the privilege of being in the palace, of being an Egyptian, of learning the languages, of never having to miss a meal, and yet seeing from the palace the suffering and the plight of his own people. They now have an inside man. I mean, moms, can you picture what it was like for Moses growing up, hearing this information about being a deliverer, hearing her whisper, you could be the one that gets us out of this mess. I'm sure that Moses wrestled with what it was like to be that deliverer. And he takes it into his own hands. He sees an Egyptian beating his fellow Hebrew, and he goes and he kills the Egyptian. And after that, learns his first leadership lesson. But people aren't going to follow him. Right? Isn't that what happens? The very next day, he tries to break up. He's being this very just person that's leading his folks, trying to separate two Hebrews, and they're like, what? Who made you leader? Are you God? Are you going to kill one of us like you killed the Egyptian? And his attempt to take this into his own hands doesn't work. His first act of defiance against his Egyptian past results in this leadership lesson. And he runs. This whole deliverance thing is over. And he sits down by a well. The part of the story that I didn't tell you is you can imagine Moses at this point in his career. Everything washed up. He's away from his family, he's away from slavery, he's away from Egypt, he's in yet another foreign country. The story that happens in the remainder of the chapter is some women, 7 daughters, come to feed their sheep, and shepherds run them off. Well, Moses is always the justice guy. He comes in, he runs off the shepherds, and he helps draw water for the women, which leads to him marrying a Midianite woman, leads to them having their first child named Gershom, which means stranger, or sojourner, or traveler. Finally, he finds a home, this man that has a heart of a Hebrew, by all external appearance an Egyptian, because that's what the daughters think, and now marries into a priestly family of Midian. And yet, even at this moment in the story, the fears don't disappear. Okay, well, what are we supposed to do with a story like this? Why do we care? And what do we do with our fears as they mount, as they pile up, as they crush in on us? Because we have our own running fears. Fears that we want to run away from, people that we'd like to avoid, circumstances that we're enduring. A difficult job or the lack of a job. Neighbors that are hard to be with or longing to actually have some neighbors. Well, in all of this, I have 2 things that I want to share. 2 things that are not going to be new that come from this story as we go a little bit deeper with it. And that is, in times of great fear, when fear presses in on us, when we don't know what to do, we are to seek the God who is in control. And we're to take the next right step. That's not new. But in this story, we have to be aware that God, though He's barely mentioned, is at work. And we, as people of God, seek God beyond our fears and take that next right step. We are surrendering all of our fears, whatever they might be. And that's something that we kind of need a warning about, because this God that we serve is not overly verbal. We may be surrendering our fears and not hearing what we want to hear. He's not overly visible either. He seems invisible. He seems like sometimes God is not around. But what we're trying to do in this series is to find that trust that is greater than or equal to all of our fears. I don't know about you, but it's easy at times as a follower of Jesus, as a human being, or even as a leader, to feel like, I'm the only one. Have you said this to yourself? I'm the only one that's doing the right thing. I'm the only one that's putting in the hours. I'm the only one that thinks in this way. You look at your life and you say, I'm the only one that's willing to do the dirty work. Where is everyone else? I'm the only one that's pursuing what's right. Standing up and saying, I'm not going to watch that. I'm not going to pursue that. No, I'm not going to take that job because of what this means. You just feel alone and isolated. And I can tell you, you are not alone. You're not alone. In fact, with this story, what takes this deeper for me is all of the ironies. And these ironies help me see that I'm able to follow this God who is in control when I can't see it, when my circumstances tell me everything to the contrary. And it enables me to be able to take that next right step. It's the ironies. You know what I mean by ironies? It's whenever something is said and yet, or done, and it actually means the exact opposite. So if you're watching a movie, sometimes a character might say something or do something, and they're not aware at all that what they're saying is the exact opposite of what they're going to experience and what they're able to experience in their next step of the story. But here, the ironies that grab me are several. Okay, there's 4 of them I want to show you. One is just the story of this Hebrew group of people, where they're resident foreigners, stuck in a country that's not their own. They've been workers, but now they're slaves. They feel forgotten by God and burdened by their extra work. They face an execution mandate. They're being intentionally wiped out. And yet they're growing. And yet they're becoming more prolific. And yet they're becoming more strong. And they have this leader, this insider, who does become a murderer and does run away. Their fears don't get eliminated. They don't get wiped out. But they have chosen to follow the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Well, maybe more graphic for me is the irony that I see in the women. Do you notice how strong these women are? They're powerful. In fact, through the women, we are seeing the very power of God. They're the ones, these women, that lay the groundwork for God to provide the rescue. Did you notice that? And they don't do it with flashy guns or flashy phrases. They simply take the next right step over and over again. Now, specifically the Hebrew women, but not just the Hebrew women, even Pharaoh's daughter. Think about how they have made difficult choices. A mom to hide and nurture life despite this execution mandate. A sister who will follow a basket along and step forward. Pharaoh's daughter didn't ask for a maid. She steps forward and says, "Do you want me to go get a maid?" That's a bold action. Or even Pharaoh's daughter. To know what her father has said, and yet to say, "I'm going to take this baby, this foreign baby, this stranger into my own home." All of these women show us that God is the deliverer. Not a one of them would point to themselves. Now, if you look at a third irony that points this even deeper, it's the men. And these are not necessarily gender-specific roles, but it's the way this story unfolds. The men are given towards control. They're going to control the environment through violence, through commands, through words, of telling people what to do, making edicts and decrees. They're trying to take things into their own hands. Even Moses, right? He's going to be deliverer on his own terms, which means I'm going to kill this Egyptian. And that doesn't work out so much. And then he can't break up a fight between Hebrews, and so he runs off. These men are trying to control things through violence and intimidation. And what's funny is, as much as Pharaoh wants to bring about death, he can't stop the life of God. He can't stop life from flourishing, from people getting married, from babies being born, from this group of people growing. Which brings us to that fourth irony that's maybe the most significant one, of God working through weakness. Weakness of one priest family giving birth to a baby during these kind of times, who ends up running off and marrying into another priestly family, adopted into Egypt, but then born into the place of Midian. It's just a sign to us that underprivileged people, overlooked people, those that feel like they're all alone, are not. That God's weakness is strength. That God's salvation is shown through insignificance. Something that, if it at first glance doesn't look powerful, it's not through power. It's almost as if Moses had to be taken out of that inside position and put outside of Egypt, outside of the land of his people, into yet another foreign country to show who the real deliverer is, that it's God. This compares for me to Jesus, someone who was focused on the outsider, the victimized, the oppressed, This speaks to me of Jesus, someone who shows us who God is by going not to a powerful position, but to his own death, to a cross. Now, I've seen a lot of fear in recent days and weeks. I've seen fear my whole life. I've seen churches that are dominated by fear, Christians that are paralyzed by fear, petrified by fear. To be afraid of other Christians, to be afraid of culture, to be afraid of what's happening in the world, to fear other leaders or doctrines or what might change in our world. There's a lot of fear in our lives right now, and there has been for a long, long time. In fact, a lot of times Christians will move into a fear of Satan or devil or evil and try to generate and perpetuate fear, try to use it for their own ends. You need to know that we're not supposed to be afraid. Nowhere are we told to be afraid of the devil, to fear Satan, or be afraid of evil. Do you realize that? Are we told to run away from evil? Yes. Flee from Satan? Yes. But fear the devil? No. Unequivocally, no. In fact, go back to the 23rd Psalm. Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Go down a little bit further. I will fear no evil. Now, why is it that as Christians we're bound up in fear? We're using fear. We're generating fear. And yet, our fear is misplaced. We are only to fear and respect God. We're only to respect Him as our leader, not fear evil, not fear Satan. And whenever we think about this, it almost is comparable to terrorism, right? I know people struggle to define what terrorism is, but it's about using fear, using intimidation, using threats to get what you want. Folks, that is not of God, period. That is not the path to use fear and scare tactics against other people. That's not the way God works. Should God be respected and feared? Yes. Should evil be known for what it is? Yes. But not be afraid of evil or of Satan. That's just not something that we need to be a part of. Because our God, when we look around and we feel like He's absent, or asleep, or derelict on His job, like why won't God show up? Just seems like God is sidelined. Let me tell you that God is present. A story like this shows it for me, where we see the strength of Moses' mother, the strength of Moses' sister, the strength even of Pharaoh's daughter, who is much like God, reaching down and drawing the Hebrew people out of the water. Could she have known what would happen from this particular child? And they didn't act out of fear. They didn't act out of terror. They act out of confidence and respect of God to do what needed to be done next. That's a whole lot of trust. Probably, again, a better way to define fear. So, when we look at our fears, and we're going to be doing a lot of looking at fear, the thing that I can tell you is we need to trust the God who is in control. And whatever fears that you're facing, they don't need to paralyze you. They don't need to put you in a straitjacket or corral you up. These fears, put them aside and take the next right step. The step of faithfulness. The step of showing the obvious, that God is God. And that He will bring my life and your life and our lives as a human race to the completion that He intends for them. We're simply a group of people that want to follow Jesus. If you're looking for people to travel this life with, I can think of no better group than this group here. They've been doing it for decades. This church has been doing it for more than a century. It's in our blood. Some of you have been followers and your parents have been followers. Others of you have had to take that step away from your family where they were not believers and you've stepped out in faith. This is a group of people that wants to follow Jesus. So if you need someone to talk with about what that looks like for you, about how you might enter the waters of baptism and be drawn out by God to be a new person, full of the Holy Spirit, forgiven, confident of who you are as a child of God, I'd be happy to talk with you. If you just need someone to pray with, I'll be around afterwards and I could pray with you. Let's pray now. God, we give you tremendous thanks. Because though our world is full of fear, we're not afraid. We are confident in you. And we are doing our best to take the next step of faithfulness to you. God, would you please crowd out the voices in our ears that would make our hearts afraid and terrorize us? God, we know that doesn't mean that we're able to escape from our fears or that we'll be escaping from significant action. This isn't about passivity. But God, we release those fears to you. We surrender them at your feet because we serve a much bigger God. A God who is in control. Father, teach us what we need to know as we make these next right steps. We pray this through Jesus who showed us this path, a path of surrender. We pray it through him who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God now and always. Amen.